much. Always a pleasure to be at Arab Advisors conferences. As an introduction, what we'll do, I'll wear the hat of the Information Technology Association of Jordan and speak on behalf of the whole sector to the government after all these discussions on that specific question. You are the guardians of the scarce resource that is the frequencies. You owe it to us, the Jordanian people, to share the studies upon which you based the value of the frequencies. There are global benchmarks. There are 50 countries or so that already factored in the higher GSM 900 value because it can be used in 3G and LTE. And there are easy benchmarks to be done. What was paid in Britain, for example, divided by the population, then you get the frequency charges per capita, per megahertz. Then you factor the differences of economics, ARPU and revenues, and you can easily have a weighted average of Europe, America, and other countries, and compare it with other Arab countries and so on, and get a fair value. And I promise you, within the coming 3 weeks, Arab Advisors will be doing such an exercise to weigh in and add value to this discussion. Now for the good news. Enough with the bad news of Jordan. The good news is we have reached the 400 million cellular lines landmark in the Arab world. Penetration rates are really high. If you look at, for example, Qatar or Saudi Arabia or Sudan, even Sudan is high. So it's massive growth in the Arab cellular lines market. And in some countries, smartphones and tablets are already over 50%. Some countries, 70% already are smartphones. Predominantly Android. Android is also following the global, in the Arab world, following the global trend as well. The boom in cellular lines has taken its toll and continues to take its toll on the fixed lines, the regular voice fixed lines, which continue to drop. Over 675,000 lines cease to exist, or actually the customers dropped them and are no longer paying for them, simply because with mobile, especially low-income households who are not users of broadband internet, they simply cut off the fixed voice line and just use prepaid mobile services. Broadband. Good and bad stories here. This slide is fixed broadband accounts, so it's either ADSL accounts or fiber to the home accounts or fixed WiMAX accounts servicing a certain household. And this looks at the number of internet accounts, internet subscriptions, broadband subscriptions, not users. And also the penetration is of accounts/subscriptions as a percent of the total population. In a country like Bahrain or Kuwait or Qatar or Saudi Arabia or the UAE, 10% of the population, the accounts are 10% of the population, which means effectively that over 60 or 70% of households are already served by broadband internet. In Qatar and in the UAE and Saudi Arabia, many of these broadband connections are fiber to the home connections, allowing offering of services such as cable TV and quadruple play and triple play. And then you have the other extreme, where there's very little fixed broadband connectivity in countries. In Sudan, for example, only 36,000 fixed broadband accounts are in the country. Mauritania, only 18,000, 0.5% penetration. So there's definitely a massive regional gap on broadband accounts. And I asked that question at the panel today. For a country like Jordan, what is Jordan doing to encourage fiber to the home and fiber connectivity in the country? Some operators are doing the initiatives, but they're all focused on the rich neighborhoods of West Amman, where the business community is, where the banks are. So it's going to be Shmeysani, Abdoun, Swafiyya, Daboug. But what about fiber to the home in Irbid, or fiber to the home in Bilfhais, or fiber to the home in Salt, or fiber to the home in Karak? What are we doing to actually encourage investments in fiber to the home. There's the national broadband network, but how will it be used to further broadband connectivity in the country? Similarly, those questions should be asked in countries like Egypt, Morocco, Algeria, and so forth, the laggards and the penetration when it comes to fixed broadband accounts in the Arab world.
So let's begin by first hearing from you some insights about the latest research taking place and focusing on ICT, new media, and alternative media. Let's begin with Dr. Joan Anderson.
Thank you. Thanks to Jawad also for inviting me back here after 10 years, which is the last time I addressed this conference. I'm an anthropologist, and I've been spending the last 20 years studying internet pioneers in this region. And internet pioneering, I know over the last 4 or 5, beginning to focus especially on social media. And so what I think I may be able to do is to talk about some of the results, not just of my research, but of others, by making 3 points. The first point would be, what are the most robust findings? What's the strongest set of findings so far? Then what are those that are less strong but are theoretically sound, that is suggestive? And finally, things that are more speculative. Now, the most robust findings are actually about users. Through different kinds of methodologies on different kinds of populations, the basic finding about users, if you ask, what is it that attracts users to social media? It's not content, it's not connectivity, it's to be with other people like myself. If you want to turn this into a catchword, it's interactivity. Especially social media users like to interact with each other, with people like themselves, and are attracted to multiple kinds of social media platforms. A subsidiary finding is that many users tend to use multiple platforms for multiple purposes. Just to give an example from myself, I only use Facebook for relatives. Facebook is the way I keep track of my second cousin's children. I use LinkedIn only for some kinds of professional contacts, but also mostly students of mine who graduated and want to get into the LinkedIn world. And I suspect a lot of people are like this in terms of using social media. Now, the data from the Middle East are a little bit different. They're not based so much on surveys. In fact, there's almost no survey research that works this way, except education studies. And what education studies keep finding over and over is that, as the way they put it, is that the predominant use of social media is social. It's not for education. Of course, this is a complaint that they make. Other kinds of information comes from things like blogger testimonies and Facebook use histories. The thing that I find in interviewing social media users in the Middle East is the most common response I get if I ask, what's your attraction to blogging, Facebook, Dig, any of these others? It's not to find information, it's to express myself. What we don't know very well is the balance between these two features, to express myself and to be with others that are like myself. But I think the basic social dynamic in social media use here in the Middle East is this balance and how people go about approaching it. Now, these are fairly robust findings. Those that are based on fewer samples, fewer populations, and fewer methodologies tend to be studies that show how users and developers tend to converge in communities, tend to converge in, if you will, sort of shifting groups of people who come together around common interests and so forth. We refer to these as communities of practice. Communities of practice are where informal learning and peer mentoring tend to take place. Think of it as sharing tips and tricks. So a community of practice could be, say, a bunch of geeks who have some experts, some newbies, some people who come in and go. A community of practice could also be people who come and find out information, share diverse kinds of information. Communities of practice can take multiple forms. A very formalized version of them would be incubators. So OASIS 500 is an institutionalized form of a community of practice. There are other incubators here in Amman, which can be as simple as, say, an office that's shared by a number of people who are sharing different kinds of information with each other, coders, website developers, things like this, which also attract then ordinary users through networks of friends of friends. This is how communities of practice work. The attraction for developers in these communities of practice is this is the way they can keep tabs on what users want and especially what users do. Developers in the social media realm are very user-oriented. not just oriented to users, they study user behavior through things that are as fancy as analytics, things that are as informal as employing them as testers, and so forth. Other kinds of examples would be computer nadi. I've been invited here in Amman over the years. I've been doing research to various computer nadi where kids, usually it's kids, want to know something and they find out that I'm around here doing research, and so they'll invite me to come and give a talk about something. Things like this. Meetups, hackathons, these are all examples of communities of practice. What communities of practice do is they link people with different skills and different interests in transitory relationships. They come and they go, okay? And they're characterized by, as I said, peer-to-peer learning, informal mentoring, and so forth. Think of it as sharing tips and tricks. Now, what's interesting about these communities, and this is where it becomes more speculative, is the kinds of cultures that grow up in them, the kinds of cultures that are attracted to them. And here is where there are the remaining problems of this kind of research. One of the most interesting things that seems to crop up over and over in the kind of cultures formed in these communities of practice around social media is an odd combination of value commitments to entrepreneurialism on the one hand and utopianism on the other. I mean real utopianism. I mean, it's not just something like corporate responsibility statements. It's visions and desires about changing the world, about making an impact, not just making an impact with a product, not just making an impact in the market, but making an impact in society. And this is where interactivity turns into a vague and often somewhat amorphous but very pervasive sense that social media provide a way of participation. This is something I hear over and over from both developers and users of social media. It gives a sense of participation in something larger than their own particular lives. On the other hand, the other thing that's combined with this is a very strong entrepreneurialism. This is especially something that you find among the developers, but you also find this utopianism among the developers. Imagine, for instance, say a website which is trying to attract people to come and say, tell their stories. What's the interest in the developer for this? The interest in the developer is not just the stories, but in getting people to do it because the developers can then develop better software. And by better software, what they mean is software that incorporates more of user behavior. By that, I mean they study what users do. They try to model what users do in a way of actually developing the software itself, not just to attract people to the sites, but to develop their own kinds of skills. Imagine, for instance, a website where you get people to write their stories. We all know about things like spell checkers, for instance. So spell checking can be something that's added to it to help make the story better. How about a grammar checker, right? I've had a lot of people talk to me about, well, I studied Arabic grammar for 12 years, but I don't think I can write an essay. I've talked to developers who have the idea of perhaps putting a grammar checker in, and so as you write your story, the grammar can be corrected, okay? I find this a little spooky and weird myself, partly because when I try to write email, I'm driven crazy by the spell checkers that are in, and try to remember to turn them off. What's going on here is a kind of enablement, okay? I think that this is an interesting sort of combination of this entrepreneurialism and utopianism. Interestingly enough, I've heard more utopianism from, if you will, more business-oriented developers than, if you will, say, political activists. But what I hear over and over from the developers who are doing this is that they're partly in it in order to develop their software skills, and to build better software, by which they mean software that incorporates more of the behavior of users. So what does this tell about convergence, which is what Jawad asked me to talk about? Well, I think the first thing is that it tells us that social media aren't really media. What they really are is platforms. That is, in their own terms, they're platforms that attract interaction, that induce, promote, provide ways of experiencing participation. They generate communities of practice that where developers try to attract users to come. They want to attract them. They want to encourage them. And especially what I think that they want to do is they want to be able to understand what they're doing and turn it into software. The developers themselves operate under a doctrine of continuous development that they call perpetual beta. So the significance of all of this is that the primary production in social media is actually volunteer labor. It's the stuff that people give away. It's the information you put up about yourself on Facebook, your likes, your links, and so forth. This is actually free labor that's given away. So the question is, where is value in this? And I suspect that where value is in derivative products. By derivative products, I mean these kinds of derivations out of what people do in attempts to model their behavior, turn it into various kinds of software and so forth. If you want an analogy, the analogy that I would offer would be the financial markets. We saw in the financial markets how financial engineers combined things like worthless mortgages into securities that could be traded. And then derivatives of these securities could be traded. Then the derivatives could be divided up and those pieces traded themselves. This, I think, is the kind of value extraction chain that's implied in social media. But that is a speculation.
Okay, Dr. Joe, let's hear your thoughts.
Thanks, Mohammed. Thanks, Jawad and the Arab Advisors team. This is my second year here, and it's great to be back. And I hope I can make some valuable contribution. I'm gonna start off where John left, actually. And what I'm gonna try and do is think of and try to summarize some of the work I've been doing and others too. My work involves a lot of work on media industries, particularly the notion of media cities, and a lot on alternative media, particularly why young people engage in doing and going on online and shooting videos and so on. And it's been great and quite revealing yesterday's session. And I'm going to highlight three important points that I think are challenges to this ecosystem. The first one, there's this overabundance of what I refer to as the challenge of inclusion. And I think what I've been hearing yesterday is a lot of talk about, and this morning actually, a lot of talk about the entrepreneurs. The folks who are interested in being online and producing content, but producing content for money. But what I have not been hearing about, and we've been sort of missing on, are the whole range of folks that we refer to as amateurs and activists, who are producing a lot of the content that is being out there as part of this convergence, that is being out there shared, and we find it on television stations. We find it making its way in terms of the convergence aspect. And the question is, why do people engage in being these amateurs and activists? It's because they feel that they are either marginalized from the mainstream. They don't feel that they are, or they feel they are misrepresented, so they want to have their own say in what's out there, or they feel completely absent. They're not actually part of the conversation. So they go about producing their own content that itself becomes the kind of free labor that John was talking about. But there's another challenge in terms of the inclusion that yesterday Jawad alluded to. In a way, it's something that we call the digital divide. The digital divide that, at least in the MENA region, we've been suffering from a lot. The huge discrepancy between the haves and the have-nots, the folks that have access to and the folks that do not have access. And that is a major challenge that I think it is in the best interests of many of the folks who are interested in convergence to address the challenge of inclusion. How do we increase the education for folks to have better access, and how do we actually get that access across? And who's in charge of this, both in terms of the money and in terms of the actual infrastructure itself? The second challenge is a perception of free media. And this is something that's endemic. This is something that at least having worked in the broadcast industry for over 10 years, we've come across that. The challenge of if we look back, the challenge of what I refer to the perception of free media is something that media organizations themselves, if we look back to the broadcast industry, the early stages of satellite television were media organizations, television stations were ripping off, were taking off films, music, and so on from European channels, from American channels, and broadcasting them without paying any rights, thinking that, well, no one is noticing. We've overcome that over the years. The other challenge in terms of the perception of free media, that access or that we can actually use media, is something that we've noticed a lot when cable was introduced in the region. This notion of the wasla, the connector, that I can avoid paying for the actual subscription by getting that free connection through the wasla. Now, the telecom industry and the pay television have worked a lot in terms of to try to get over this perception of free media. But still, we're still struggling in terms of finding this type of viable business model whereby the consumer is still thinking of this notion of as having access to the free media. What Kharabish here and U-Turn are trying to do in Saudi Arabia is trying to find a kind of a business model that still keeps it free for the consumer, but having somebody else, i.e. advertisers, pay for it. And one thing that I feel is kind of missing from this conversation is the role of advertisers in this, and how we can capitalize on this. This morning's presentation was pretty, pretty damning in terms of trying to see, to what extent we can capitalize on advertisers and convince advertisers to actually pay for it. The other question that we have is when it comes to pay television, and we're a few days away from a big challenge in terms of the football rights and what's going to happen in terms of who's going to pay and what and how much revenues this is going to yield when it comes to the pay TV packages. The third one, which is I hope it would strike some chords here, is the notion of the regulatory challenge, and a closer look. And some people have done an excellent job in terms of researching the regulatory environment in the region. And one of the concluding remarks about this is the fact that it is an environment that's principled on control and not to provide an enabling environment. So regulation, which always comes after the fact is done, is not intended, it's more intended to create control and to curb rather than to create an enabling environment for both the public at large and the producers and the companies themselves. So what we see is that governments and companies are interested in two types of revenues. The governments are interested in taxes as revenues, and the companies are interested in revenues, and that the battle is happening between the two, whereby the public interest is sort of being missed out from that conversation. The interest of the consumers is somehow being fought out, not by the public itself, by the governments who want to use this to increase their revenues, and by the companies who want to do the same. And we've seen this dramatically happening in the reorganization of public broadcasting in the region. This has been happening since the mid-2000s and still ongoing. And the reorganization of state-owned broadcasters is happening pretty much to create a quasi-commercial environment, whereby anything that is sort of public in that sense is missed out, and the governments, by recreating these television channels, are somehow competing head-to-head with the commercial channels, not creating an environment in which the public can feel represented. And I'll leave it at this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for these very valuable insights. Now, before we open the floor to questions, I actually have a couple of questions. First of all, I was wondering if I could get your thoughts about the drivers behind content producers. Okay, many of the content producers basically produce content that is for free. What drives these producers? Is it, for example, just to get fans? Is it publicity? What exactly are the drivers behind content producers? What encourages them to actually do content? Dr. John?
Well, the specific drivers are as varied as the people who are actually producing it. If you think in terms of, say, strictly social media, there are a few experiments out there where somebody wants to try to be their own political reporter, somebody wants to be their own movie maker, and so forth. Okay? But as I said, in the aggregate, if you look at this in the aggregate, it's not so much thinking of producing their own content as it is of being together with other people and interacting. As they begin to think about content, the usual gloss on this is, especially as I've said in the interviews I've had with people in this region and blogger testimonies, Facebook histories, and so forth, it starts off with a desire to express myself. These two drivers, to express myself and be with other people, quickly meet each other because you express yourself and maybe you want to get some feedback. And you want to get feedback not necessarily from strangers, but from people who are like you. Okay? So I think these are, in the social media realm, the principal kinds of drivers of this kind of informally produced content. The more formally produced stuff in the social media realm is generally coming from professionals, especially people who are trying to turn social media into a marketing tool by attaching themselves to this kind of interaction. So they'll talk about interacting with the customer, engaging the customer's interests, creating an environment when the customer feels good about what they're doing, and so forth. These strike me as actually, if you think about in terms of how sophisticated some kinds of advertising are, as a kind of primitive first steps into the field by professionals who want to kind of leverage these social dynamics that that I've mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, it's, I agree. I mean, there's a whole range of groups out there and individuals wanting to do this. But if we are to actually put them in broad categories, there's definitely the money incentive. There is this whole perception that, you know, I can be the next Bill Gates. I can be the next person who's gonna become the first millionaire, as we've seen in the first panel. There's definitely this drive, but there is also this drive towards sharing. There's definitely this drive towards making a voice and making or having a voice and making yourself be present in this realm. And in countries like ours, where the ability to express oneself is very limited, access to platforms has been very limited. The presence of these tools has been a kind of an empowering level for the groups that I mentioned, the marginalized, the misrepresented, and the absent groups.
Thank you. And now, nowadays we hear much talk about pan-Arab content. Okay, now, I don't know, is this the right way to categorize content? What do we mean by pan-Arab? Do we focus, for example, on religion of Arabs, on the geographic location? What exactly is meant by pan-Arab content?
I'm perhaps not the best person to talk about this. My observation is that pan-Arabism is a term that applies to a great many things and a great many different kinds of content. I think it's false to imagine that there's only two kinds of reference groups, either all Arabs or people in my country or people in my neighborhood. The thing about social media is it allows all kinds of reference groups to express themselves. So there's a multitude of reference groups that are out there. It might be politically active youth. It might be people who are interested in music. It might be people who are interested in food, such as we heard this morning, for example. The thing to understand about social media, I think, is that this was actually a concept created by marketers who asked themselves, what do we do with the web after the dot-com bust? And the answer was social transactions. Okay? And what they eventually managed to do is to attract all kinds of reference groups to form. These may be very small, a small group of friends. It could be people in a neighborhood. It could be students at a university. It could be people with, say, progressive political views that they don't feel are expressed through political parties. It could be religious groups. I'll give you a simple example. Everybody here has probably heard of the Facebook girl. Remember the April 6th youth movement back in 2008 in Egypt, where this young woman created a Facebook page for the youth movement, and she became famous for this, and she got arrested and thrown in jail, among other things. Well, she didn't start off being a political activist. She started off on Facebook, where she went for religious sites, religious instruction, where she went for places to be with her friends, where she went to follow particular musicians she was interested in, and so forth. In other words, she developed these skills informally. Okay? She also worked for a DVD company, so she had a DVD production company, so she had some sense about how to do this. Okay? So I think the answer, part of the answer, is that Pan-Arab ideas can come up quickly if this is a particular reference group that you're trying to address or to make more real or to create.
I think there was a time when we could think of Pan-Arab as a market, and this might be challenging for many of the folks here. I think there was a time when we can think of Pan-Arab as a broad market, because even, and I think we're somehow a little bit off, because even when we were thinking of Pan-Arab as a market, what was actually being produced was a product that would attract particular countries, namely Saudi Arabia and Egypt. And if we can get everybody else, that was fine. But that was the main target, and we sort of called it Pan-Arab because it made sense that we can include the others. I think what we're moving on to is what John alluded to, is these types of local groups that are somehow what I would refer to as being trans-local, meaning the kind of groups that are locally based, locally anchored, but they are connected through one form of affinity or another. So the gamers across the Arab world, the food lovers across the Arab world, the connection that cuts across or it moves beyond the fact that they can only speak Arabic, or that they are only practicing a religion, or that they are, so going towards very, very specific affinities. And the television industry caught on to this on two levels, by creating the niche channels, and also by what recently NBC started doing in terms of creating specific channels and sort of moving into a market like Egypt. I think increasingly after the Arab Spring, when people are becoming more and more interested and able to speak about what's happening in their own backyard, that push towards a more localized is going to become stronger.
Okay, now we'll open the floor to questions from the audience. We have a question from Mr. Jawad Abbassi.
Hi, good morning. Thank you, John and Joe, for joining us with academic insights. You both worked in the US and also you cover the Middle East and the Arab world. Have you seen any differences between the North American convergence dynamics and the dynamics that you have here in the Arab world and with multiple countries and so on? Just your sort of what's similar and what's different between the two regions?
I think in terms of similarities, I think we're globally integrating like never before. The fast pace in which the adoption of practices is taking place in the region is somehow unprecedented. So in terms of the transfer, this is happening really, really fast. And there are several, I mean, we can discuss why this is happening, but part of it, this is being driven internally by the way these companies are moving on to becoming more business oriented, and in doing so, they're having to deal with a mindset that is business oriented. I think in terms of differences, I think what the figures that you've shown yesterday in terms of the penetration somehow are misleading in the sense that, yes, we have that type of amount of penetration, but the penetration is uneven. And uneven in terms of the adoption and uneven in terms of what we do with it. And I think this is where we will see that I think more research needs to be done that goes into the mindset of people, a more sort of one-on-one, trying to find out what happens. One of the examples that I would talk about is a difference in terms of finding out what happens exactly in the houses during Ramadan. We've got a lot of research that tells us, okay, what's the best shows that have been produced, but we have or the way that have been followed, ratings and so on. But we have no research on who controls the actual remote control in the house. How do people make their choices when it comes to which programs do they follow, and what type of interests do they have in the actual shows that they watch? What triggers their, all what we've got is hunches from advertisers and from television schedulers, but no real insight when it comes to that. This is something that in the US, when it comes to the Christmas season, which we compare it a lot to Ramadan, we have clear insight on what happens inside the house.
Joe mentioned one of the things that's in common between this region and North America is the speed by which these technologies and the practices that go along with them have spread. And I think that this is not to be underestimated at all. I think it's connected to another thing that is common, is that social media are particularly a domain of youth, and especially of youth who then share interests internationally. My daughter may not be interested in the same musicians that your daughter is interested in, but they're both interested in musicians, for example. I'm more struck by the similarities in these social media practices between North America and here. And I don't think it's a simple matter of diffusion. I think it's a matter of youth culture sharing. I think it's partly a feature of the technologies. Things like blogger.com and Facebook were available and were in use in Egypt and Jordan within 6 months of the time that they were broadly in use in the United States. Take Facebook, for example. It was created in something like November. It was all Harvard students in January. It was all Ivy League students in March. Then they took off and went to Palo Alto. It was all students in North America by September, and there were Egyptians on by October. Okay? So these things spread very quickly, but they spread in particular demographics. They spread through reference groups. Okay? And I think this is a similarity. The difference, I would say, is that I think it's still problematic. I don't understand myself quite the social dynamics in this balance between expressing myself, wanting to express myself, and wanting to be with others like myself. I suspect it's a little bit different here than it is in North America. I suspect that being with others like myself is primary and expressing myself is secondary in North America. What I hear from bloggers and Facebook users is that expressing myself seems to be more primary. But I would not say that this is a definitive finding.
Okay, I think we still have time for one more question from the audience, if there's anyone who has a question. Okay, if this is the case, I do have a question about the regulators in the Arab world. Okay, let's talk about the regulatory scene in general. Okay, how can regulators enhance the content production scene in the region? What can they do, and do they hinder or enhance the content production with what they currently do, from the idea that you have currently?
I think my approach to this would be to say that you need to think about regulation as a whole and not just about what regulators do with respect to telecoms and media. And if you do, regulation as a whole can be thought of as 3 levels. The most specific level would be things like the telecom regulators, and their basic job is to keep the telecoms in the proper lines of their businesses and so forth. Beyond that, there's a broader government regulation, which has to do with the content of things that can be said in public, for example, the content of acceptable kinds of speech, rights to speech, and so forth. Beyond this, there is, if you will, a more general kind of cultural level. There are other culture managers out there than the government. There are religious authorities. There are social authorities. There are various kinds of political authorities. If you think of regulation this way, then the kinds of regulation that sort of most immediately impinge upon things like social media tend to be more cultural and, if you will, kind of governmental. Simple example, up until 2 years ago, the internet was free of censorship, was free of any kind of government attention to the content here in Jordan until they passed a law to apply press regulation to it. So bloggers had to register as if they were newspapers for all practical purposes. Okay? That's a kind of regulation that comes down. In terms of, say, the telecoms regulators or the, I don't know, the syndicate of media people and so forth, I don't know that they necessarily have much to say other than the kind of message that you were getting yesterday about what everybody who's in the business wants is they want the regulators to get out of the way.
I think one of the interesting findings that a recent research that at Northwestern we were engaged with revealed is that I think it was over 60% of Arabs want more regulation of media, and which was kind of surprising in a way. And I think the problem that we see is that, which I alluded to, is that the creation of an enabling environment. The fact that regulators, what I think regulators are missing out on is the fact that there is a race, there is a competition between the various Arab countries in order to create this type of enabling environment. The creation of media cities, of which Jordan has been a pioneer, has been to create a kind of enabling environment for these investors to freely engage in the production of media. But what has happened along the way is that it has not reached that type of fulfilling goal. But what is being missed out is that these investors can take their money and go anywhere in the region and can go anywhere outside the region. And they can provide, and even as individuals, there are so many ways to bypass the control in order to get your message out. So involving the public in the design of regulatory frameworks, I think is somehow what's being missed out on.
Okay, thank you so much.